Thank you, and welcome to the House Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. Today we're just going to have one bill on our agenda, 8148. That's a resolution that I introduced. That essentially, what we're really dealing with here is we're calling on the federal government to restore funding to the Centers for Disease Control Lead Prevention Program. Excuse me. Again, I think we're going to have witnesses that are going to really give us a better sense of it, but what we're really looking for is something that's a relatively modest figure from the federal terms, but in a state like Rhode Island, it's very critical. We really have a much higher lead burden here in Rhode Island, and I think it's important that we make sure the federal government does step back up. I want to mention that our congressional delegation has been great at advocating for this. And have long been advocates for it because, again, they know Rhode Island needs this kind of support to be able to get these sort of things to happen. So without further ado, let me move right to Liz Colon, from a parent from the Childhood Lead Action Project. Just center
Okay, just wanted to make sure it was on.
The button up to be on.
It's on. All right, so thank you for hearing this today, Representative Handy and members of the committee. We appreciate your time and consideration in this important resolution. I'm Liz Colon, and I am testifying in support of H8148. I'm wearing two hats as I speak to you today. For the past 13 years, I've worked to end childhood lead poisoning as an advocate and an educator for the Childhood Lead Action Project. I've also stayed in this fight because I'm a mother of a lead-poisoned child. In 1996, 4 months after moving into our first home, just a couple of blocks from here, my son Sam was diagnosed with lead poisoning. His lead level was 36. At that point in time, he was put on a waiting list for a lead inspection. And the following month, when he went to Hasbro Children's Hospital to the lead clinic, he was hospitalized immediately for 5 days because his level went from 36 to 52. At that moment, lead paint had changed our lives forever. We were new homeowners who thought we had captured the American dream, and yet with a very sick one-year-old child, it quickly turned into a nightmare. I am that terrified mother on the other end of the phone trying to comprehend the magnitude of what a nurse is trying to explain. I'm the mother who has done her best to protect her child, that hard-working person who makes ends meet, provides food, clothing, and shelter. Waiting lists, lead inspections, hospitalization, chelation therapy, iron supplements, developmental assessments, countless needles and blood tests, early intervention, caseworkers, lead hazard reduction specialists, you name it, I've been there. It took 6 years for our son's lead level to finally drop and stay below 10. Now he's almost 17, and yet we still struggle every single day. We deal with depression, joint problems, extensive dental work, digestive issues, learning problems, all of them still remain. My family has endured the emotional toll and financial burden, and even though it was about 16 years ago, I remember all of it. Every feeling I had then, I still feel now, even today, as we deal with the health effects that will remain for a lifetime. When we need funding the most, we have the least. One way to make our problem appear to go away is to make it invisible, and that will happen if Rhode Island Department of Health lead program isn't funded. It's a direct result of devastating budget cuts. This is also happening at the same time that the Center for Disease Control is lowering the threshold from 10 micrograms per deciliter to 5, increasing the number of children in Rhode Island more than sixfold, from nearly 200 diagnosed lead-poisoned kids to 1,279. Without immediate intervention, the Rhode Island Department of Health and 34 other state health departments will be devastated by extreme funding cuts on the federal level. By eliminating funding to our health department in Rhode Island, we'll lose the capacity to monitor lead poisoning cases, to respond to every child who has an elevated blood lead level, to provide a home inspection, referrals for medical intervention, and remediation of lead hazards. This will also be critical, we'll lose critical prevention efforts that will likely disappear regarding proactive housing policies, community education, and outreach. What will you say to that family whose child has a lead level of 8, who was invisible to the data before but is now considered poison? What do you tell a mom like me whose child's blood lead level jumps from a 36 to 52 and then is hospitalized? What will happen to Rhode Island as a national leader on this issue? Although extreme budget cuts might render childhood lead poisoning invisible, The impact could not be greater. Cuts will likely widen the achievement gap between white and minority students and between healthy and poor students. High blood lead levels are associated with a decline of about 15% in reading scores. Children poisoned by lead are 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. Studies show that educating a child with lead poisoning costs an average of $38,000 on top of what we already pay for, per student. Gutting the childhood lead poisoning prevention program will leave more children behind and send us on a race to the bottom instead of a race to the top. While continuing our work with our congressional delegation to restore federal funds, we support the passage of 8148, and we urge the governor and the General Assembly to step up to the plate, provide emergency funding for Rhode Island's vital lead program. It's less than 1% of the $102.7 million surplus that was recently announced. We can't afford to do otherwise.
Thank you, Liz. Any questions for Liz?
How's your child doing now?
He still struggles.
Yeah.
Struggles a lot.
Do you know how he came in contact with the lead?
It was the lead dust from our old house. We lived in a house that was built in 1892.
Thank you. I'm glad your son's doing.
Thank you. I also have written testimony from myself. I just want to also say I have written testimony from a few folks who were not able to attend. The American Lung Association, Ready to Learn, as well as the Audubon Society of Rhode Island.
And Liz, now I know I have this document. That's something this is the one that sort of shows us how many children were exposed to lead with blood lead levels of 5 and up. I know my town, Cranston, is number 3 in the list with 1,058 over that time period, and I live in a not as old as yours, but an 1928 built house, and I know that was something. In fact, if I'd already been working with the Lead Action Project before that, so I think I had more awareness than the average parent certainly does going into those things. And again, we didn't have a child yet even at that point, but I guess what I was going to say is because we only do a lead safe standard here. What I was wondering is, do you have a sense of perspective, or does the Lead Action Project have a sense of perspective on what this program really, specifically what this program can do for us, and when it goes away, what we're going to lose, I guess, is the best sort of way to put it along the way.
What we're going to lose is being able to respond when we find out a child is poisoned. So we're good at Rhode Island and Massachusetts are really the only 2 in the country that have this universal screening. So we screen kids under the age of 6, and we're really good at it. So we know what our numbers are. The problem is once a child is diagnosed, what do we do with them? There will be no mechanism for that referral from that child to get to EI. There will be no in-home education. There will be no case management. It also leaves us very vulnerable as a state because it'll be very difficult, and I'm sure other people here today are going to testify to this, that it will be very difficult to stay competitive. Rhode Island gets a lot of money from the federal government, from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, to be able to run their lead remediation programs. If we're not competitive with our data and we can't track where the poisonings are happening, we're going to have a problem continuing to receive that money.
Thank you. Next we have, let's see, we have J.R. Pagliarini from the City of Providence. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. I'm J.R. Pagliarini, Senior Executive Advisor to Mayor Taveras in the City of Providence. Mayor Taveras is grateful to you, Representative Handy, and to the General Assembly for their leadership in preventing lead poisoning and strongly supports this resolution to urge President Obama to restore funding to the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. As you may be aware, Mayor Taveras launched the Lead Compliance Initiative last summer to begin enforcing lead safety standards in rental housing in Providence. In addition, the mayor has been committed to the implementation of the Lead Hazard Mitigation Act, and Providence is the first city in the state to enforce that law. Our Department of Inspections and Standards has earned the respect of the lead poisoning prevention advocates by diligently enforcing the law and developing an implementation process that should be a model for other communities. I am before you today because this issue disproportionately impacts Providence children. From 2005 to 2009, 7,644 Providence children were lead poisoned beyond the threshold determined by the Centers for Disease Control Advisory Committee's recommendation for immediate intervention. The next highest number was in the city of Pawtucket, with 1,924 children exceeding that threshold. Additionally, a 2009 study of Providence kindergarten children showed that 2/3 of the kids had too much lead in their blood when lowering the threshold for intervention. Studies show that high blood levels are associated with a decline of about 15% in reading and math scores. Children poisoned by lead are 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. Studies show that educating a child with lead poisoning costs an extra $38,000. If even half of the children with lead poisoning incur these costs, that's a $10 billion price tag. Providence also has HUD funding for our lead poisoning prevention program, which the previous witness alluded to. That funding could be jeopardized if the city cannot compete for federal funding if we are not able to demonstrate our program's effectiveness because we don't have that data available. For all these reasons, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, we urge you to support H. 8148. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pagarini. Questions for Mr. Pagarini? Just one, I know, again, I absolutely agree. Providence is clearly the, obviously it's a larger city, so bigger population, but still, I know with I'm a district neighbor to Providence.
Yeah.
I see that along the way, and as
Yeah.
I said, Cranston's number 3 on
Yeah.
this list. Do you you probably don't know it off the top of your head, but if you wouldn't mind getting us, I'd be curious about how much you guys spend on your special ed figured.
I don't have that information available, but I will get it for you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Mr. Pagarini. Let's move on to Jim Vincent, the NAACP Providence Branch.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jim Vincent. I'm the president of the NAACP Providence Branch, and I'm speaking on behalf of the bill, and I'm wondering how we even got here. We see at the NAACP this issue is not only a health issue, but it is a civil rights issue, and in fact, it's a human rights issue. 20 years ago, near the end of his 15-year tenure as head of the NAACP, Benjamin Hooks, one of our most celebrated presidents in our 103-year history, saw that the battle for legal access to voting, education, and employment had largely been won. He wanted to work on the next battleground, the health and environmental inequalities that impact people of color just as surely as these earlier challenges. Working with Republican Jack Kemp, this is a bipartisan effort, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Hooks founded the Children's Health Forum and selected lead poisoning, considered the most preventable environmental health hazard facing children today. As its focus, Hooks and Kemp worked with Congress to win a $50 million appropriation for use in communities with the highest incidence of childhood lead poisoning, an amount that by 2006 had reached $200 million. One example of the group's success, the number of children in St. Louis with elevated blood levels decreased by 39% over 4 years, and the number of housing units designated lead safe nearly quadrupled. By axing the program, Congress has abandoned low-income and children of color who are disproportionately impacted by lead nationally. African-American children are 3 times more likely to suffer from lead poisoning, and in some locales, African-American children and Latino children are 8 to 9 times more likely to enter school with a history of lead poisoning. We've heard the numbers in terms of dropouts in juvenile justice system, kids that are trapped by that system. We have enough. So this bill needs to be approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent. Questions for Mr. Vincent? There was something you had said that I lost track of. Oh, but again, it was $50 million. And what year was that?
This was about 20 years ago.
And that was only for St. Louis?
No, yes, but it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, and I didn't say it, and I was thinking somebody else might, but I mean, just for the audience's perspective and folks that are watching later, I mean, we're only talking about a $30 million program, and again, only is relative in Rhode Island dollars, but it is a really small number, obviously, on the federal scale, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that we really have to get this money restored. Thank you, Mr. Vincent.
Thank you.
Now let's have, I think it's Maria Gomes. I'm sorry. Is it Mara or Maria?
I'll be translating for her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just make sure the button is up. Thank you.
I am here on behalf of the bill to beg you to uphold the bill because my daughter just came from Africa in July with 4 children. They were recently diagnosed with lead poisoning. I'm a breadwinner. I was devastated by the lead poisoning of my grandchildren because we don't work. We have minimal income. For both me and my daughter, we live together. And if this funding is cut, we are going to be further devastated. We never had information about lead poisoning. We have no idea. We just knew that something like that actually exists. Because of the lead poisoning diagnosis of my grandchildren, me and my daughter cannot walk now. We are basically preoccupied by going to hospital appointments back and forth. A lot of organizations and great individuals have been helping us, including Rhode Island Housing and other organizations around the community. I don't have much more to say.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Gomes? Thank you very much, Ms. Gomes. We appreciate you coming to tell your story. And before I call the next witness, I want to just recognize the committee members that are here with us today, just so folks know this is a 2 o'clock hearing, so it's harder for folks to get out of work to come in. To my right, we have Representative David Bennett from the City of Warwick. To my left, we have Representative Donna Walsh from South Kingstown, Block Island, and Westerly. And Charlestown, excuse me, I'm about to leave that one out too. And then to her left, we have Representative Lisa Tomaso from the from the town of Coventry and West Greenwich, not Exeter. No, just the 2. All right, let me go ahead and move on to the next witness then along the way here. Excuse me, move on to Janine Castleman.
Representative Handy, members of the House Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. My name is Janine Castleman. I am the lead remediation attorney for the Rhode Island Medical Legal Partnership for Children. I provide legal assistance to families at Hasbro Children's Hospital to their pediatric clinics. And it is through this connection that I regularly meet with families who are dealing with issues of childhood lead poisoning. Parents residing in all parts of this state come to me generally after receiving the news that their child has an elevated blood lead level, that the effects of lead poisoning is irreversible, and that their family's home is the most likely source of that lead. Here's what I see. Parents are angry, bewildered, and frightened. Here's what I do. I attempt to help the families receive what is due under the law. Maybe this means a tersely written letter to a landlord. Maybe it means a court order compelling the landlord to remediate the lead hazards using the laws that many of the people in this room passed. These legal actions provide some solace to parents, but it is not enough because we know that lead poisoning is a completely preventable problem. Here's what the Rhode Island Department of Health provides. The potential to ensure that lead poisoning statewide is a preventable issue. There is already evidence of the success of our state's lead poisoning prevention program. If the federal funding is cut, so goes the prevention. Rhode Island children do not deserve to be lead poisoned because our federal government has made a budgetary decision. Children are more important than budgetary politics. Therefore, I urge this committee to respond in two ways. First, pass this resolution requesting President Obama to restore funding to the CDC Healthy Home and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. The federal government needs to be reminded of its responsibility ensuring the health of our children. Second, please work to find $600,000 in state funding to keep the lead program going. If the federal government fails to prevent lead poisoning for American children, let our state not fail Rhode Island children. There is a surplus in the Rhode Island budget. Is there no better way to spend this money but on our children? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Castleman. Questions from Ms. Castleman? Thank you very much. We appreciate your comment. Vincent Green with Motley Rice.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to appear here today. My name is Vincent Green, and since 1998, I've had the honor and privilege of representing children who've been lead poisoned. I'm here today to urge passage of this bill for two simple reasons. One, because of the past, and one, because of the future. You should all, and everyone in this room should be very proud of the work that the state has done, and in particular the Department of Health has done in reducing the incidence and the severity of lead poisoning since the time I began practicing law. When I began to practice in this area, it was not uncommon for us to see our clients with blood lead levels well in excess of 50 micrograms per deciliter, and I can tell you that we had many clients whose blood lead levels were in excess of 80, and several clients whose blood lead levels were in excess of 100 micrograms per deciliter. Indeed, we had one client when I began practicing whose peak blood lead level was 185 micrograms per deciliter. Those levels are essentially unheard of today, and the exact reason is because the funding of the programs of the Department of Health and the hard work that the people there have done. Since the time I began, we have seen a consistent and steady decline both in the number of clients and the severity of their lead poisoning. We do not and cannot return to a day where children are more commonly chelated and admitted to the hospital than they are otherwise. If this funding is not restored in one way, shape, or form, those days will return, unquestionably. But I'm also here to talk about the future. You've heard from several of the other witnesses testify about the costs of lead poisoning, the costs of education. I want to add into that the societal costs. There are plenty of studies that make it clear that children who are lead poisoned are less likely to finish high school. They're less likely to become gainfully employed. They are more likely to become what is known in the literature as juvenile delinquents, but there is a criminal aspect to this. The societal costs are exponential. For every dollar that is spent in prevention, you will see tenfold costs 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road. And as a society, we cannot permit that. I'm here to tell you that I have been doing this long enough now that those early clients that I spoke of when I began in the late 90s representing children who were lead poisoned, I see them now frequently as they come into my office for other reasons. And I can tell you that the problems caused by lead are permanent, they are severe, and they are costing our state in many, many ways. I do want to add one other aspect to this that doesn't often get talked about. As those blood lead levels go up, this is not purely a cognitive issue, not purely a behavioral issue, not purely an IQ issue. For children under the age of 6 who are lead poisoned, particularly those who are severely lead poisoned, there are associated medical consequences beyond the cognitive, beyond the central nervous system. Lead is deposited in most of the blood-rich organs in the body, and its half-life in those organs and its half-life in bones is much longer than it is in the bloodstream. And so in addition to the cognitive problems, we see in the long term children as they grow into adults who are at increased risk for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, renal disease. As you go down the list of blood-rich organs in the body, each one of them is affected in the long term by elevated blood lead levels. Add in addition to that, particularly for young girls as they grow into women, if they've had significant lead poisoning, that lead stays in their bones. At the time of pregnancy, it can and does leach out and get into the bloodstream and pass the uterine protections and poison a fetus. We are talking about exponential consequences that this state has worked for 2 decades to reduce and avoid. Without funding, they will in fact return, and that's why I'm here to urge passage of this resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I really appreciate that. Questions for Mr. Green? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Appreciate that. Now we have, I think it's Joanne Casello. Did I read that correctly? Oh, I'm sorry. Of course.
Thank you, Representative Handy, and thank you to the committee as well. My name's Joanne Costello. I'm a nurse educator, and I have a master's in public health. I teach at Rhode Island College, and I've been there for the past 15 years teaching public health nursing. I've been a nurse for 31 years. And in my capacity in both of those roles, I have firsthand observed the devastation that comes about with lead poisoning. I also had a child who at 1 year old was diagnosed with or had a lead level of 11 micrograms per deciliter. The complications, as you have heard from other experts, are irreversible. And there's often more than one child in a family, as you heard from the people who just spoke, who are also affected by this issue. And they are doomed for the rest of their lives, it's irreversible, to behavior and attention problems, failure at school, hearing problems, kidney damage, and dialysis resulting. Reduced IQ, having extensive effects as far as our special education. I heard you ask J.R. Pagliarini about that. I know that we are per capita in Rhode Island, I don't know about Providence, but one of the top per capita spending on special education. And also slowed body growth. This becomes a moral and ethical issue when we think about the human suffering that's involved. We know exactly how to prevent this problem, and we have the capability to do so. We have actually, over the years, used evidence-based interventions recently and have had tremendous, tremendous positive outcomes from it. But while improved, we are definitely not finished. The number of new cases and the persistence of these cases is something that we can't give up on now. I'm well aware of our state and national crisis financially at this point in time, and know that you hear many competing causes that come before you on a regular basis. I ask, as you decide whether you agree with this resolution, that you think of a child in your life that you love, a daughter, a son, a grandchild, a niece or nephew, or these beautiful children that we have in the audience, and think of their bright eyes in mind. If you had a choice to allow them to be poisoned or to take action to prevent it, what would you do? These children that may be affected are no different and deserve the opportunity to face this very complicated and difficult world with their full brain power and the bodies that they were given without the devastating effects of lead poisoning. And lastly, aside from the moral and ethical piece, withdrawing our support for the prevention of lead poisoning will lead to astronomical costs to society, educational costs, criminal justice costs, healthcare costs that are entirely preventable. If you think that 38 studios is a symbol of Rhode Island's lack of foresight, lack of judgment in deciding what we should do as far as preventing issues from occurring, lead poisoning will surpass this in costs. And as my grandfather used to say, penny wise and pound foolish. It's a very small drop in the bucket right now if we spend the money on what we should be spending the money on to prevent these causes, and then to wonder down the road why did the legislature allow this to happen? Why did the federal government allow this to happen when they could have prevented it? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Costello. Any questions for Ms. Costello? Thank you very much. Amelia Rose, Environmental Justice League.
Thank you, Chairman Handy, and thanks so much for proposing this this resolution. I'm representing the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, and we strongly support H 8148 to restore this funding for the lead poisoning prevention program. And I think that the resolution really, hopefully when it does pass, will send a really strong message to Washington that in Rhode Island we really care about this issue, and that we think that this program is vital for the protection of kids here in our state. And the Environmental Justice League, we work mainly in the urban core cities of Rhode Island, mainly in Providence, which is our largest environmental justice community. We primarily work with communities of color, low-income communities, and around environmental health issues that directly impact those communities the most. And as we've heard from other testimony, we know that lead poisoning disproportionately affects low-income children, children of color as well. And these are children who are also exposed to additional kinds of toxics in air, land, and water in their neighborhoods, and don't deserve to have a chance in their own home to be safe from these kinds of toxics as well. And so I'll just reiterate my last point that you've heard before, that we really urge you to pass this resolution, but also to take responsibility for this problem as a state as well, to fund the lead poisoning prevention program this year to fill this budget gap, and to really urge the leadership within the legislature to fill this budget gap for the fiscal year 2012. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Ms. Rose? Thank you very much. Greg Garrett?
Good afternoon, representatives. Thanks for taking this hearing. Most of what I would say has been said before. I just have a couple of quick anecdotes. One of the things I do is I help train doctors. I'm not a doctor, but I help train doctors about the environmental hazards of Rhode Island as they come into the residency program at Rhode Island Hospital in Hesborough. And their jaws almost drop. You know, these kids fresh out of medical school, their jaws almost drop when they hear about the lead problems in Rhode Island and what's going on. And I'm doing these tours with a public health pediatrician, and so we kind of tell them what's going on, but it's important. They are almost shocked at this. The other thing I did is about 14 years ago when I first moved here, I was doing a little research for the Mental Health Advancement Society in Rhode Island, and they asked me to try to figure out what was going on with this, and I called up people in the criminal justice system, and I said, so do you guys have a lot of lead clients in the criminal justice system, in the ACI? You heard the juvenile statistics. I don't have statistics, but I'll bet that the statistics at the ACI for lead poisoning are just as bad. You know, that the kids who grow out of the juvenile justice system end up in the ACI and in other places like that. And if we're going to deal with budget issues, you know, 3 people at the ACI for a year, there's your $600,000. You know, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you need to really be thinking of long term, is how do we really move ourselves forward. We can't make our economy work if we've got lots of lead-poisoned adults. You know, we track them as kids. We don't track them as adults. We need to think about this on the real long-term basis. So yes, encourage the federal government to take its responsibility, and the state legislature needs to take its responsibility as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Mr. Garrett? Thank you very much. Next, we have Jill Beckwith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on this important House resolution today. I'm here representing Rhode Island Kids Count. I'm submitting some written testimony there that shows you the tremendous progress that Rhode Island has made in terms of reducing the percentage of children who have lead poisoning over the past 2 decades. As other people who have testified have said, we have made incredible progress, and we're so close to getting there in terms of solving the problem. Now is really not the time to quit. We really have issues with racial and ethnic disparities, low-income disparities here in Rhode Island. Some data from one of our other indicators in terms of, older housing, which was an issue that came up at the earlier part of the hearing, is that we have 83% of low-income children in Rhode Island live in older housing, which is housing built prior to 1980. And we're #1 in the country for that. So it's one of those things where families can do their best, but if the housing stock is the housing stock, that's sort of what you have to deal with here. So we have this perpetual problem until we solve some of these issues. And, you know, in thinking about it from a public policy perspective, I'm sure you don't need to be convinced in terms of the negative health outcomes, the negative educational outcomes that are here. And when you think about the huge issue that you have in front of you in terms of how to spend precious state resources, I know that you all want to invest in things that work. Clearly we have something, the efforts that we've been doing have worked. We have data to show that. We have data to show that we can help kids keep from getting poisoned and keep them, if they're poisoned, at a very low level and treat them very quickly. So we encourage you, obviously we're very much in support of this resolution, and if federal funding is not able to be reinstituted, we strongly encourage you to identify additional funding opportunities that might be used to support this program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Beckwith. Any questions for Ms. Beckwith? Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming. Jim Lucht.
Chairman Handy, members of the committee, thank you for letting me speak on this issue. I'm going to be very brief. I'm information director at the Providence Plan. We're a private nonprofit. We do a lot of analysis of state data sets. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Department of Health and do analysis for them yearly. I'm here not really to talk about, although I'm a resident of Providence, I've lived on the south side for about 12 years. I'm not here to talk about this as an urban issue. I'd like to present the map to my left here that I prepared for the Childhood-Led Action Project using State Department of Health lead test data. And the main point of the map is really that it's not just an urban problem, even though the majority of cases of elevated blood lead levels go on in urban areas because of old housing and because of density. That it's not purely an urban issue, and that it occurs anywhere where old housing is, and it's not being maintained. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lucht? Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming in. Derek Brown.
Thank you, Representative Handy and committee members. My name is Derek Brown. I'm a parent of 3 autistic children, 2 of which have had lead issues. And I just want to say that we are all here for the same reason. We are here because we care about children, we care about lead levels in Rhode Island. You know, as the speaker before me said, this is not a black or white issue. This is not a rich or poor issue. This is an issue of humanity. This is an issue about the responsibility of our state to take care of its citizens. My son DJ, on top of having autism, we found out last year that he was lead poisoned. The lead caused him to be hyper. The lead caused him to be unfocused. It affected his learning in school. It affected his behaviors at home. This was a great concern for my wife and I. And had it not been for the Lead Action Program coming into our home and educating us on how to lower the levels in our home, we would still be dealing with high lead levels in our son. Thanks to this program, his levels have come down to half. You know, it is so important that this funding come through. Whether the federal government does their part or not, it is incumbent upon the state of Rhode Island to do our part. You know, we are the taxpayers, and we are asking the House and the Senate and the governor to do something about this issue. We cannot afford to sit by and watch children fall through the cracks and suffer the permanent damage caused by lead poisoning. It's not enough to go in afterwards and do something about it. I would like to urge the committee to begin to work on legislation that would provide enforcement that would force the landlords to do this ahead of time so that we get to the place in Rhode Island where no child will ever be lead poisoned again. We cannot afford to drop the ball on this. You know, earlier this February, we saw the championship in the NFL go from one team to another because of one dropped ball. If we drop the ball on this issue, it can make the difference between being the leader in this country on lead poisoning prevention or being the state that comes in last by just simply dropping the ball this one time. I'd like to encourage everybody to call your senators, call your representatives, call the governor. Let's make a difference in the state. Let's allow these children to grow and be healthy and reach their full potential rather than suffer under the lead poisoning and become a statistic in the state rather than a healthy, productive member of society. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Do you have any idea how old your housing is? We were talking about age of the housing. Do you have any idea?
My home was built sometime in the 1930s.
About the same as mine then, okay, all right. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Welcome again. Bert Cooper?
Hello, thank you for allowing me to speak. Is the right chair? Closer. Is that better? No?
Is the button, the red button, is it out or is it in? We want it to be out. No? Try again.
Bingo.
There we go.
All right, thank you. My name is Bert Cooper. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I work for the Coalition to End Childhood Lead Poisoning. It's actually a Baltimore-based firm that grew out of parents who had organized to eliminate lead poisoning in their community in Baltimore. Through my organization, I am working here locally in Providence, where we've established a branch office to initiate the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, a key component of which is to eliminate lead hazards in low-income homes while we also make them energy efficient and safe for the occupants. In an effort to not be repetitive, I just wanted to make a couple of points and provide some context. One, to say that we strongly support H8148, calling on the President to fully restore the Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program at the CDC. In addition, we encourage the legislature to provide stopgap funding for FY12 to fill the program gap left by the current cut as we work with our partners in congressional delegations from our GHHI sites around the country to restore federal funding in FY13. I should say we are a national initiative. We're working in 17 different cities and all the delegations in these cities to get this funding restored. The point I want to make is that I don't want to repeat much of the testimony that's been previously made, is I think it's helpful to think about this also in terms of an economic development issue. One very compelling example from here in Rhode Island is just over the past year, both Rhode Island Housing and the City of Providence have each received $3 million lead hazard mitigation grants from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Without the data that comes from the Department of Health, we wouldn't have even been eligible to apply. Having that data in place is a baseline criteria for even putting in a proposal. If we're not able to collect the data through the work of the Department of Health, we're not able to get past go with those proposals. That's $6 million in new resources coming into Rhode Island to fund construction jobs and to work with these families with sick kids to mitigate these issues. So I don't want to lose sight of that. It's an important story given what's going on with our construction sector these days. A little bit of context. Last year, in Rhode Island, there were approximately 325 children who were newly diagnosed with lead poisoning. It's not entirely clear to me that without the CDC program, we would actually know that. Which is a scary thought in terms of being able to connect these children to really critical services. With the support from the CDC, the Department of Health is able to follow up, inspect the homes, and order repairs with lead hazards. And we're working on the program side to be able to deliver those repairs with our partners more effectively, to leverage additional resources and work smarter. In terms of some context with the appropriations, last year, FY12 appropriations provide only $2 million for the CDC's Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. That's down from $29 million in FY11. That's a 94% cut that we're receiving, and it's unclear moving forward if we're not able to restore that funds that we're going to have anything to work with here in Rhode Island. And if that isn't restored, it's going to result in the elimination of several programs and the possible resurgence of blood lead levels. And again, I would tie that back to some jobs down the road as we work to get this problem solved. So without repeating a bunch of former testimony, I just want to reiterate that we are strongly in favor of the bill and look forward to working nationally to, with our other cities to make sure that this funding is renewed at a federal level. And we urge you to provide stopgap funding so that we can continue the program here in Rhode Island. And I think one last point I'd like to make is the work of the Rhode Island Department of Health is something that I highlight in my travels around the country as I'm working in other cities. Just recently, the city of Philadelphia has been looking to improve its surveillance of lead hazard or elevated blood levels in children. And I was able to point to the work here in Rhode Island as an example and a model for them. So I'm eager to see it sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Any questions for Mr. Cooper? One thing, I wasn't able to find it in your testimony. If you don't mind just making sure, the $6 million discussion, that piece of that economic development piece, I think it would be nice to, as an extra piece that honestly I hadn't even really thought about in this equation, but I think it does sometimes help to have a really well-rounded argument to be able to push for these things. So if you wouldn't mind submitting something about that, I think that'd be really helpful.
I would be happy to. I have to confess, I thought of it as I was sitting here listening to the previous comments.
No,
Thank you.
obviously, it's not what we think of first, but it's always helpful to have that as well. Thank you very much. Next, we have Jessica Bueller from Rhode Island Housing.
Hello, thank you for allowing me to testify. Rhode Island Housing thanks you, Chair, for introducing this resolution, and also we know our congressional delegation is very supportive of restoring this. Rhode Island Housing, on behalf of the state, does administer the grant that Mr. Cooper spoke of, that is from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And working in partnership between the Department of Health, Rhode Island Housing's program, we've seen great success. As we've heard, though, the housing stock is old here, poses significant risks, and we've also heard that competitiveness for this HUD funding is dependent on the Department of Health funding because we rely heavily on the data that we can get from them to apply for this program.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Bueller? So if you also wouldn't mind getting that, if you could tell a sense of, give us a sense of the impact of not having that data in terms of the other projects you work on, I think that'd be really helpful as well.
Okay, we'll give you something more specific.
Thank you very much. Liz Tobin Tyler.
Good afternoon, Representative Handy and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Liz Tobin Tyler. I'm the Director of Public Service and Community Partnerships at Roger Williams University School of Law, and also a lecturer in public interest law. My expertise is in the relationships between poverty, health, and law, and I have written and teach in that area. I've been working on the issue of lead paint poisoning since 2001, and really my work has focused on not only crafting better laws to address lead poisoning, but also to ensure enforcement of those laws. In 2001, when I began that work, 1 in 5 children entering kindergarten in Providence was lead poisoned. I was told when I began the work that Providence was the lead capital of the country. We have made incredible strides since that time, and that is due to stronger legal enforcement, but that is also due to the effectiveness of the Healthy Housing and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. The number of children, as you have heard, who have been lead poisoned in the last 10 years has dramatically decreased. However, that does not mean that the problem does not still exist. And as you've heard from many people, we cannot declare victory. Particularly in low-income neighborhoods where the housing conditions are particularly poor, far too many children, especially children of color, are still poisoned, leading to lost opportunities for them as individuals, for their families, but also incredibly increased health and educational costs for the state. I think you've heard very eloquently from the parents here today what the impact of lead poisoning is on individual children and families. As a lawyer and as a health advocate, I know that continued vigilance is required to ensure that children are not only screened and that there is appropriate and timely intervention when children are poisoned, but also that we continue primary prevention in this area, and that includes continued enforcement of lead laws, and the Department of Health is incredibly important in that effort, as well as in screening and addressing the needs of lead-poisoned children. As we all know, lead poisoning is entirely preventable, yet it brings significant long-lasting burden to children, families, schools, and the healthcare system. If we stop the efforts that we have worked so hard for over the last 20 years in Rhode Island, we are going to be back where we started, and that is not a place we want to be. So I encourage you to support Representative Handy's resolution, to urge President Obama to restore funding for the CDC's Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. But as others have said, it is important, if that doesn't happen, that the states step up and make sure that we don't move backwards. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Tobin Tyler? Thank you very much. Steve Fishback?
Good afternoon. Thank you for providing us the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm here representing Rhode Island Legal Services, and Representative Handy asked that our agency appear before this committee to speak about this resolution, and that's what I'm here to do. On behalf of Legal Services, I'd like to lend my support, or our agency's support, to this very important resolution to restore funding to the Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. Most of the speakers have focused on lead poisoning, which is proper because of the very acute and long-lasting health effects that lead poisoning causes. But in addition, this program also funds the state's, or most of the state's, Healthy Homes Initiative, which deals with other types of environmental hazards in homes, including asthma triggers, chemical poisoning, injury prevention, and all of these things, all of these problems, whether it be lead poisoning or substandard housing conditions, are problems that affect our clients disproportionately, and which is why we are here to testify in favor of the resolution. The type of things that the state does with its Healthy Homes program are very, very important and very nicely complement our efforts to privately enforce housing laws, lead poisoning laws, and provisions of the Landlord-Tenant Act, which allow tenants to force their landlord, to seek court orders to force their landlords to make repairs. But if that's lost, those services are probably even more important because there's so few of us lawyers out there that are able to serve the public, whereas the health department provides a much broader range of services and reaches far more many people than we have the resources to do. Many of the speakers have talked about a need for a state appropriation. It seems pretty clear that regardless, even if this resolution passes and even if funding were restored, that there would still be a time gap for which funding would be unavailable for our health department. And thus it's really important for, in addition to this resolution passing, for those who are working on our budget to find the $600,000 that's needed to keep the state's Healthy Homes program in place. So I don't want to repeat what others have said other than to stand with them in support of why this resolution is so important and ask that in addition to supporting this resolution, you consider finding funding for the state's Healthy Homes program.
Thank you, Mr. Fishback. I don't have a sense of how many folks you're able to help each year as an organization, but proportionally, do you know about how many proportionally sort of fall into that sort of healthy homes, whether it be lead, asthma, or things like that kind of category around the landlord-tenant stuff?
The way that we keep our case statistics is about the problem that people come to us about. So unless our a client self-identifies that they have a problem like that, we don't have that kind of data, or at least not yet. We're actually moving in a different direction to allow us to have some more comprehensive data. But if you look at the reports that Rhode Island Kids Count puts out, there is extensive data showing that poor people live in substandard housing disproportionately, that low-income families disproportionately suffer from lead poisoning and disproportionately suffer from asthma. There is some data also showing that non-white children are disproportionately affected by both lead poisoning and asthma. So there are other data sets that are probably a lot better than ours. And the health department does generate this data too, and having that function lost because of the lack of funding, it just sort of shows you again why it's so important to maintain this program.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Fishback? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you coming. Thank you. Jamie Rhodes. Not here at the moment, at least. Kate J. Kate J. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Katie J. Definitely J is right. I'm sure about that. Okay. Dr. Fine from Department of Health. Dr. Michael Fine. Thank you very much, Dr. Fine.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify in favor of House 8148. Lead poisoning prevention and treatment is a major public health success, or has been. I can remember a time not too long ago when the minimum acceptable level was 40, and we saw lead poisoning all the time. We now see about 250 cases. That number's about to increase to over 1,200 because we've determined that there is no safe level of lead in anybody's bloodstream. To lose this program is an incredibly painful loss for all of us in Rhode Island. We are a state and a nation without a healthcare system. And lacking that healthcare system, we have no way to address lead poisoning house by house and street by street. What the Department of Health does is to try to substitute for that absence of a healthcare system by helping identify and follow up on identified cases of lead poisoning. As I said, we'll have about 1,200 in the coming year. We have 25,000 cases of asthma, of childhood asthma. About 11% of the state has asthma altogether. We're losing our capacity to respond, and this is not something that insurance is going to pay for, and it's not something that healthcare reform is going to fix. If we want children who are ready to learn, we need to find a way to continue doing lead poisoning prevention. So from my perspective, we need to turn over every leaf, squeeze every sponge, do everything we can think of to find a way to bring this back. And I don't know how to say thank you enough for bringing this to the public's attention and to the General Assembly's attention. We have great support. We probably have the best congressional delegation in the United States fighting for us in this regard. But anything you can do to encourage that fight and that support is something we are eternally grateful for.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fine. And I know I got to see you a little bit at the asthma panel that Senator Whitehouse was convening. And again, I remembered him asking the CDC person that he had brought, that came in to testify, with the sort of dollar, you know, how much benefit do we get for each dollar spent? And I think, if I remember right, he said, for every $1 we spent on lead prevention, it was a $200 return. And I actually forgot to mention that at the beginning. So seeing you and hearing you again reminded me of that. So it's just disturbingly short-sighted if we don't get the funding restored. Any questions for Dr. Fine? Thank you again, Dr. Fine. John Kelly?
Chairman Handy, representatives, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm John Kelly. I'm the president of Meeting Street, and I'm here in my role as president of Meeting Street. Too often we work with a lot of children who have elevated blood levels, and we see the impact it's having on their development, both as children, and we know it's going to continue on into adulthood. And what I want to do is just reiterate a couple of the points that were made and then close, and it won't be long at all. The first is we really want to reiterate, based on the kids we see, they come in all shapes and sizes. They come from black communities, they come from Latino communities, they come from white communities. It is a community issue. It is, and we are all one community, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing kids from every facet. One of the things that one of the speakers mentioned is the CDC just lowered the blood lead levels from acceptable from 10 to 5, which is great. But as Dr. Fine testified, there is no such thing as a safe level of blood. There's just nothing. We were fortunate to have Dr. McLean, who came from Johns Hopkins back in 2009, to present her study on blood lead levels in children. And just having elevated blood lead levels, it could be 1. You showed a increased likelihood of reading below grade level, a failure to graduate from high school, and increased likelihood you're involved with the criminal justice system. So any amount of blood lead levels is just, it's unacceptable. We've made a lot of progress, both as a state, as a nation, and as a community, and what we want to do is make sure we continue to make that progress. We obviously would like to see President Obama and the federal government step up and really fund this the way it should be funded. If they can't, we encourage the state, you and all of your colleagues, to do what we can do to help all of our children. And finally, in closing, when we look at this, it's the work, it's not just the housing, but it's also the work that happens afterwards. As I mentioned, we see a lot of children with elevated blood lead levels. One of the things that Rhode Island could do that could really lead the country is make it an eligibility criteria for children for early intervention services. And that's a program that for the bulk of the costs are paid for by either Medicaid or third-party insurers. And by making it automatically eligible, you'd have tons of children from birth to 3 who will be picked up, and you could be helping to work with them and their families to help them catch up developmentally. So we encourage passage of Representative Handy's resolution, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, with what you talked about also, again, if we obviously intervene early, it's much more likely that we wouldn't need to continue to intervene or come in later to intervene at all. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be intervening a heck of a lot less. And I think it was, I forget, one of the speakers had mentioned it, you would see a decrease in your population at ACI. You would see that. I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, studies have shown the investment you're making at those critical years, it's incredible. You want to impact, you know, we were talking about No Child Left Behind, 3rd grade test scores. It doesn't start at K. You know, it starts prenatal care and it starts when a child's born.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Kelly? Oh, and we do have Kate, thank you very much, Ms. Kelly, we appreciate it. Kate J. has come from West Bay Community Action.
Thank you, Chairman Handy and members of the committee. My name is Kate J., and I'm speaking in support of House Bill 8148. It is imperative that the federal government restore the funding for the Centers for Disease Control's Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. I am the Lead Outreach Coordinator and Case Manager at the Lead Center at West Bay Community Action. My catchment area includes Cranston, Coventry, Warwick, West Warwick, East Greenwich, West Greenwich, Exeter, North Kingstown, South Kingstown, Hopkinton, Richmond, Narragansett, Charlestown, Westerly, and New Shoreham. When a child within this...
You actually catch all of us then.
Yeah. When a child within this area has an elevated blood lead level, I receive a referral from the Department of Health so that I may contact the family and set up a home visit. During these home visits, I educate the families about lead exposure and instruct them on practices that may help lower their child's level and lessen their exposure. While my case management services are funded through Medicaid, I am able to get in touch with these families in need of services because of the Department of Health's lead program. They are responsible for organizing the lead testing data and communicating it to the pediatricians, lead centers, and the community. Without this continued funding, a critical piece of this infrastructure will be gone. When I am working with a client who has been hospitalized and is undergoing treatment, I am in constant communication with the Lead Poisoning Prevention Program staff.
the coordinating of services for the family, making sure that the proper measures have been taken so that the environment is safe for the child to return to is a huge part of the process. It is so important that these services remain intact for the state. I love working with these children and their families and passing along the information and education about lead poisoning prevention. We have made quite a bit of progress, but there is still so much more to be accomplished. In the wake of the Centers for Disease Control's recent acknowledgement that the lead reaction level should be lowered, it is all too critical that we continue to move forward in our fight against this preventable disease. I ask that House Bill 814A be passed to restore the funding for the lead program, and I also ask that the state fill the gap in the federal funding for the fall so that the program will continue to run the year. Thank you, Chairman Handy and members of the committee, for your time and consideration in this matter.
Thank you, Ms. Jay. Any questions for Ms. Jay? Now, that's the end of the witness list. We are going to, I am going to just actually recess the committee. I'm hoping we're going to convene quickly at the Rise as well to hopefully be able to consider this so we can move to the House floor. I really am very gratified by folks coming out in support of this. The one thing I want to repeat that I think everybody was saying was preventable, and I think that's the key thing we need to remember. This is a preventable. It's something we don't even necessarily need to have to treat after the fact, because if we prevent it in the first place, obviously we don't even need to spend a penny on treatment if we've managed to prevent all our kids. And in the end, I think it's not just about the pennies, it's about protecting our kids from a lifetime of pain along the way. So thank you again, and again, the committee's at recess.